Are you ready to be unmessable with? Well, you are in the right place. Welcome to Be Unmessable With, the podcast where you get the inspiration, strategy, and coaching to be unmessable with, no matter what life throws at you. And now, your host, Jocelyn Herman-Saccio.
Hey there, welcome to Be Unmessable With the podcast. I am your host, Jocelyn Herman-Saccio, and this episode is part 2 of my interview with my dear friend, Robin Quivers, media icon from The Howard Stern Show. And in our first part of the interview, Robin really talked about how she grew up and developed what we call an unmessable with mindset, and a lot of personal examples about instances where she stood up for herself and really created her own path. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, you might want to check that out before we dive into part 2 today. It's completely accessible wherever you get your podcast, wherever you're hearing me or seeing me right now. But in today's episode, we pick up where we left off. And we left off with Robin joining the Airforce, realizing that might not have been such a smart thing to do, given she doesn't like to be told what to do. So I hope you enjoy today's episode and continue on the journey of being unmessable with the amazing, incomparable Robin Quivers. So when you have power, you don't need force and you don't need all that stuff because you have an access to impacting things.
I even noticed in the Air Force, when I was in the Air Force, that was a real big mistake.
I thought you were going to say that was a real big adventure.
Well, everybody knew but me that I don't like authority. So when my friends heard that I was going into the Air Force, they were like, "Are you crazy?"
Oh my God. They're going to beat that power right out of you. Not quite.
They do this. And I said, "Oh, come on. It couldn't possibly be like that." And then I got there. And people were out of their mind. And I was like, ooh, this is going to be tough because I don't automatically do anything. I don't automatically confer authority to you because of your rank. I don't automatically listen because of, the bars on your shoulder. I don't automatically do anything. So this is going to be interesting. Because that's what they do. You're given instructions. Here's how you salute. Your bar looks like this. Anything, like you get one single bar when you come in as a second lieutenant. And then the next level up is 2 bars. And then there's some other medal they put on you as you go up in rank. So everybody with a bar or 2, anybody with 2 bars and up, I'm supposed to salute, right? And I'm also not to talk back. I'm not to ask questions. I'm not to do all of this stuff.
This sounds like a great job for you.
Yeah, because they have more bars than me. And so this became a big problem because I'm not just a soldier. I'm a soldier with a job to do, a specific job to do that has its own rules. I'm doing nursing. So I don't care what your bar says if you don't know what you're talking about.
Yes, right. If the illness or the wound says this, your bar is trumped.
That's right. And so this was a big problem for me. And one day, this captain sees me, and I'm doing something on the floor. And he says, "Nurse, I need you to give this medication to this child." And so I read it and I said, "I can't give that medication to the child." And I was going to explain to him why. But he just grabs the order sheet from me. He said, "I said, you're going to give this medication." And I said, "I can't give that medication." He says, "Lieutenant, I said, give this medication. I said, I don't care what you call me. I'm not giving that. And then he goes, Major, to his resident. She won't give this medication even though I've given her the order 3 times. And the major looks at it and says, you better be glad he didn't do what you said, because this is an adult dose. And so from that point on, he knew, is it all right?
You trained him. You trained him well.
And so that's what I was like, this is a game. This is an unreal game. These bars, they don't really mean anything. And if you don't make sense to me, I'm not listening. So we had a new chief nurse come in, and she changed all these rules that had been part of this hospital for years. And all the civilian nurses walked out en masse. And so now she's only got like a quarter of a staff, because the civilians really ran this place. They work for the Airforce, but they were the majority of the employees. So she decided to implement these 10-hour shifts, and she was going to make everybody work 10-hour shifts. And that was long before people started kowtowing to stuff like this. And these nurses were like, no, we like working our regular shifts, and we like 8-hour shifts. And if you do that, we'll all quit. And that's exactly what they did. So one day I walk into, I don't know that I was a problem, but I walk into work and a staff meeting is breaking up. And I'm like, there was a staff meeting today? And they're like, yeah. And I said, well, why didn't anybody call me? And then our head nurse, who was a captain, says, Lieutenant Quivers, I need to speak to you alone. And I said, no, you don't.
I'm a little worried that the staff meeting was about you.
No, I said, no, you don't. You don't need to talk to me alone. If it was a staff thing, you should have called me for the meeting. She goes, please, please, please let me speak to you alone. So I go, okay. So I walk into the nurse's station with her, and she said, Lieutenant Quivers, the chief nurse who just came on board has decided that everybody in the hospital, even though we're fully staffed and we have all the people we need, she can't have one unit in the hospital working like we used to and the rest of the hospital on 10-hour shifts. So we have to go to 10-hour shifts too. And I just moved her out of the way, and I walked over to the phone, and I called down to the chief nurse's office. And I said, hello, this is Lieutenant Quivers. And the receptionist said, we've been waiting for your call.
Like I said, you trained them.
So I go down to the chief nurse's office, and she's sitting there behind her desk. And before I went, see, I was a terrible person. Before I went, one of the nurses said, oh, don't go down there and make a fuss. I said, why not? And she said, because if you do, she'll write out a psych evaluation and send you to the 4th floor.
Uh-oh. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest starring Robin Quivers.
So I said, oh, if she does that, I'll push her desk into her throat, and then I'll take that consultation. Welcome to the 4th floor.
Oh my God. You were
so
rogue.
I go down there, and she says, I've heard about you, and we're not going to have any trouble. And I said, okay. And she sits me down, and she says, do you know what I do? I said, I have no idea. And she says, well, maybe you ought to come follow me around for a day and see what it is I do. I said, when would I do that? After my 10-hour shift? And she's like, oh, and she starts yelling, and I start yelling. And then all of a sudden, this is just, these little cubicles. And she suddenly realizes that other people can hear this colonel yelling with a lieutenant. And so she immediately says, That's it. You say one more thing and you'll work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I said, if you make one more encroachment on my time, I won't work at all. She just said, get out, get out. And so I
wore down
and went back to my floor. And the next day I walked into a standing ovation because the 10-hour shifts were canceled.
Wow.
And I said, stop it. I didn't do it for you guys. I did it for me. You guys would let anything happen to you, but I'm not going through that. And so that was the thing. It was just like, and nobody, I was like, when are they going to send me to jail? I am the most insubordinate person.
It's like, you're waiting. You were ready to take the punch, like at Halloween. You were ready, but no punch came.
I laid out the outfit because I said, oh, they got to arrest me this time.
Oh my God, you are too funny.
But it was so funny because they always did what I told them to do. So, you know, she was really sure this girl will not come if I order her. And then I don't want anybody to know that I can't control my staff. So that was like the big thing hanging over their heads, that they didn't want a problem person.
Right.
Because then that goes up the chain of command that you can't do your job.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It reflects on you.
Right. And so they were all always begging me, please, please, please do this. Please, please, please do that.
Oh my God.
So eventually, this unit was just, it was awful. This one unit I was working on. And I went down to that same chief nurse's office and I said, you got to get me off that floor. I want to go somewhere in this hospital where you don't practice medicine because you people are killing. You're going to kill somebody. And she goes, well, where do we not practice medicine? I said, pediatrics. And so she assigned me to pediatrics if it would keep me.
Talk about being the author of your life. And we've only gotten up to like 50 years ago. So now, like, we're going to have to do a series of these interviews to get everything in. Because that's like, you know,
that this was me from the very beginning. It wasn't like I ever had this attitude that somebody knew more than me, or, you know, they'd have to explain it if they did.
And that's one of the things, but that's one of the things that's really, I think, unique about you is that you're always in a state of learning. Like, you want to learn. You want, you know, when you first started trading in the stock market, it wasn't like, oh, I'm just going to trade in the stock. You were like, I want to know everything. I want to study every Dow dividend paying stock. I want to know what their patterns are for the last 5 years. I want to know what their earnings have been for the last, and it was like you're like an immersion person. You're like, you know.
Absolutely. If I'm going to be, you know, I didn't get into a car and not know how it worked before I started driving. You know, there's some things that could be very dangerous if you get into it and you don't know what you're doing. And I always took my job as a nurse very seriously because patients' lives were in my hands.
Yes, yeah.
And so that was more important to me than pleasing this person or that person because of anything, you know, whether they were the supervisor or the chief nurse or, you know, whoever they were. And I learned a lot from the people around me as well. When there were good leaders and there were not so good leaders.
Yeah.
And, you know, I had my confusions over the years. And I remember when I first started working in hospitals, I was still in high school. And, you know, I was a pre-nursing student and I wore this little uniform, but we really did the work of aides. And all the aides looked like me. And I didn't want them to think that I thought I was better than them. I don't know why I had but I was like, I need to ingratiate myself to these people so they understand that I don't look down on them and I think they're equal to me and so forth. And, you know, they were nice and, you know, I was very funny and, you know, would joke with them and all of this stuff. And one day we had this supervisor who everybody was afraid of, and she came up on the floor to do her rounds. And, you know, everybody would scatter. Oh, she's coming and look busy, you know, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And then one day she left the floor after doing her rounds. And then we congregated in the nurse's utility room and started smoking cigarettes and laughing and talking. And I was imitating her with my back to the door.
Oh, no.
And so I'm standing there doing my imitation, and everybody's laughing. And then all of a sudden, everybody got quiet. And I was like, uh-oh, she's right behind me.
That's like a movie, you know.
I turn around and there she is. And I was like, oh, crap, I just lost my job and I really need this job. And so she immediately broke up the whole unit and sent everybody to different floors. And she happened to send me to pediatrics. And so I was like, oh, God, I don't know what this is going to be like. But I got up there and I was the only person beside the nurse working up there. So I was doing my thing and working. And this supervisor came up. I think her name was Mrs. Haynes. She comes up, takes the nurse back into the nurse's station and says, how's she doing? And she goes, she's great. She's just, you know, she's just been working since she got here. She's taking care of everything. And so then she came out and she pulled me into the stairwell. And the first thing she said was, I'm not here to be liked. I don't care if you like me or not. And I was like, wow.
Impressive. That's what I want to be. Yeah, exactly.
That's fire. I want to be you.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, because I really thought the hatchet was coming out, right? And she says, and you're not like them. And I'm like, what? She says, you have an opportunity to go somewhere in your life. They're not going anywhere. And I was like, oh my God, she's right. You know, I'm trying to please these people who, you know, they don't care whether I get where I want to go or not. You know, they're perfectly happy for me to blow whatever opportunities I have and wind up staying there with them. And she said, so I'm going to be watching you. And I said, okay, fine. And that was the end of the conversation. I finished out the night, and the next day she gave me one of my favorite assignments, which was the emergency room. And then some point during the evening, she came in and said, how's she doing, to the staff? And they said, oh, she's great. And, you know, and I was doing my job, and eventually she stopped watching me. And I was like, she knew I had gotten the message, and I was never going to be caught in that situation again. And, you know, and I went on from there. But, you know, even that taught me, it was just like, don't try to please everyone. Everyone can't be your friend, and you're not here to be liked. And there is a job to do, and you have goals. So don't let your sympathizing or wanting to relate to, you know,
wanting to fit in or whatever all that
I
is.
didn't care about fitting in. I felt like I needed to make them understand that I didn't have any feelings about them that would have been untoward. You know, that I thought they were fine and I was going to do my job and so forth. But I went a little too far in trying to be one of them to prove that I was okay. And so, yeah, that was another thing. It was just like, I'm not here to be liked. And, you know.
And what were your goals then? When you were working in the hospital, what was your vision for your life? You know, like, what did you really see as your aspirations or goals?
Well, I first started out thinking I would go into nursing and then go to medical school and become a doctor.
Really? What kind of doctor did you want to be?
I hadn't thought that far.
Okay. All right. Let's not get carried away. All right.
It was just like, what do you do in life? I want to be a doctor. So, but when I got to the hospital and saw what doctors were like, I was like, I don't want to be that kind of asshole. And so it was just like, nah, don't want to be a doctor. they have these attitudes and complexes, and they're spewing their crap all over everybody. That was another time. So doctor comes up on the floor. I've been running my butt off. He doesn't know. He just got there. And I finally have time to sit at my desk and start charting. And he's standing there writing in his patient's chart. And without even looking at me, he says, "Don't these patients need something?" And I didn't look up at him either. I said, "Yes, they need doctors." He almost lost his crap. The nurse came running out from the back and said, "She's young.
She's young. She's new. Forgive her."
And I was like, wow, that was interesting.
That's funny.
But yeah, I was never, I'm like, I always knew I'm not here to be played with. I'm not here for you to exercise your ego on. This is my life. And so if you want to do all that other kind of crazy stuff, don't pick me. That's why I said, I tell people, you don't want to do that, because it won't work out for you.
Trust me on this.
Yeah. So, when I got to NBC, there was this guy who came up to me one day. Howard, had just gotten there, and then he got me there. And this program director comes up to me on like the first day I'm there. I'm sitting there getting an orientation. So I'm just sitting in the studio with Howard, watching, what goes on. And he comes in, walks up to me, and he puts his hands at my chest, like this. And he doesn't touch me, but he's doing that. And he says, "Howard, what am I doing?" Howard says, "I don't know." He says, "I'm tuning my radio," and runs off.
That's a mistake.
I was like, "Howard, what have you gotten me into?" He says, "I told you it wasn't going to be easy."
Oh,
and goes back on the air. And so a few days, weeks later, or whatever, I used to see interns coming out of his office crying. And I was just like, "Why do you go in?" "Well, I don't want to lose my job." They're not even paying you. You're an intern. So one day we used to take turns getting lunch for each other. And so I go upstairs and I come down and I've got ketchup and French fries and hamburgers and, cheeseburgers and drinks all on this tray.
A nice vegan meal, yes.
Yes, take this all into the studio where we're going to chow down while we do the show. And something hits my butt. He's standing there and he just takes a swat at me. And I just turned around and said, "Oops." And I threw the whole tray on.
And
Nothing
what did he
needed
do?
to be said. No words were exchanged. And I walked back into the studio. And that was that.
And that was that last time, right?
He knew, not her.
And what made you go into radio? I mean, here you are in the hospital, you're working in pediatrics, you're doing whatever you're doing. What on earth? How is that bridge?
It was really kind of bizarre. I just sort of threw myself on the mercy of the universe, because I had gotten to the point where I knew I didn't really want to be a nurse. And that wasn't really my calling, and it wasn't satisfying to me, like in a systemic or spiritual way. And so I said, I thought when I came into the Air Force that it was where I was that was the problem. But I now see it's what I was doing. And so I've got to find myself a new career. And in order to sort of make it through the rest of the time I had in the Air Force, I started going to community college and just trying different things. And they had a theater group there. And I joined the theater group and learned how to make sets and, do different things in the theater world. And I was like, wow, I really love this. This is fun and I really enjoy it. And it's making my time here bearable. And so then I got out of the Air Force and I went to California, and I worked for this broadcast consulting firm that used to sell sales materials, you know, to teach people how to do radio sales and stuff like that, to radio stations all across the country. So I'd get to talk to radio people all over the country. And I was like just taken by the fact that they all seemed to enjoy what they were doing. They were all happy and, you know, they just loved it. And I thought one of these days I ought to look into that radio, because people seem to enjoy what they're doing there. And when I came back to Baltimore after, you know, just not really figuring out what I wanted to do with myself out in California, I opened the Yellow Pages and I said, you're going to find 3 schools and you're going to go to each of them, and whoever convinces you the most, that's what you're going to do, because you really don't know what you're going to do with yourself. And the first, I found the broadcasting school, a marketing school, and a business school. And so I made the first appointment at the radio, the broadcasting school, and I went to see them. And the guy who talked to me, he was so amazing and so enthusiastic about what he was doing and what this was, that I said, nobody's going to do better than that. And I never kept the other 2 appointments, and I signed up right that day. And the moment I got into that school and started doing it, I was like, oh my goodness, this is where I belong. And the first day, that the president came down to meet the new class, I raised my hand to ask a question, and I don't even remember what the question was. And he said, see me after this class is over. And I was like, what, are you not supposed to ask?
Now you're in trouble. Here we go. They heard about you from the hospital.
So I went up to see him after the class, and he said, Robin, most of these people are never going to be in radio, but you could be. And I said, really? And he said, yes. And so I'm going to introduce you to everyone I know in radio while you're here. And I'll make personal introductions for you. And you go, and he told me, you wear a suit, you do this, you do that. And, you know, you keep in touch with those people after you meet them. You show them what you're doing. You tell them where you are. And I can trace my path to Howard Stern right from introductions I got at that school.
Amazing. And do you remember the guy who did the introduction to the school? Do you remember that person? Did you ever get back in touch with that person after you?
I knew him for a little while, but you know, I was on such a fast track. It was like radio was waiting for me to get there.
Yeah.
Because I got my first job before I graduated. The guy I came to replace at that first job took me with him to his next radio station. I worked at that radio station 6 months and then wrote a note to one of the guys that Mr. Jeppy had introduced me to in Baltimore. And he just so happened to be creating a new show. And he came and he said, send me a tape. And then he had me come one Friday after I got off the air where I was in Harrisburg. And he said, he offered me a job. So within 6 months, I was working in Baltimore. And then as soon as I got to Baltimore, I started getting calls from a woman named Denise Oliver to work with Howard Stern. So
amazing. That's like meant to be.
I was like, yeah, you guys were waiting for me. I'm glad I got here.
Well, when you say you trust, you threw your life to the universe and trusted. I mean, when things are meant to be, there's flow like that. And it sounds like the flow. But what I hear really as a theme, Robin, is, you know, that nurse who said you're not like the rest of them, this guy who said you could make it, the whole world of mentors and the importance of mentors, I think is so not emphasized nowadays, you know. And I know I can say the same thing in my life, you know, the person who believed in me to run a company at 20 and, you know, like just, you know, the kind of believing in people and tapping them on the shoulder and saying, you're big, you're capable, you're special, you're whatever it is such a treasured and impactful thing. How has that like influenced you in your life, other than obviously getting you on this path, but the whole world of mentorship? Because I can hear it as a theme with you.
Oh, well, again, I was like, I don't know how all these angels got put in my path, but they were all there and had, you know, an incredible impact on my life. And so when I do believe in passing it on. And so I find things that I like and think will be beneficial to people. And I'm always open to, why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? Here's something you could do that might help you with seeing what you should do in that situation. You know, so I've always been open to offering people, self-development and financial information and, whatever it is I'm doing. I love to talk to people and hopefully open them up, because I have had a great deal of freedom in my life. And I think that's one of the things that people are missing, is that you're free. You don't have to do anything. And if you want to do something, do it 100%. The only reason these people were doing these things for me was because of how I showed up.
Yes.
And so that's what I say to other people. Don't just be hanging around going, how does this happen? That's not going to get you anywhere. Nobody's coming to get you.
And I remember you told me a story once, and I don't want to tell the story because I'll get it wrong, but it was something about like you came out of, like you were wearing a suit to go to an interview, but you came out of like this broken down car or something like that, but you look good or something. What was that story? Do you know what I'm talking about? Say that again.
When I first moved to New York, I had the worst car that you could ever imagine. People wouldn't even steal it. I could leave the keys in it and they'd be there. That car would be right there with the keys when I got back. And so I always said, Robin, they have no idea how you got here. And, what are those other things that you might consider drawbacks? They don't know that until you tell them. You can give them an indication of that if you want to, or you could be your best self when you show up and be prepared. Because there were a lot of times people offered me things I didn't think I was ready for as I was going along. And I was like, this is what they call opportunity, Robin. You better get yourself ready.
Yeah, commit and then get ready.
That's right. You say yes and then you fake it until you make it. You'd better be able to, any number of things. Even in nursing, I got, I talked my way into an internship where there weren't any. And all my friends said, well, you're not working this summer if you keep having that dream, because they don't accept interns. So a couple of month or 6 weeks later, they were like, so what did you wind up doing this summer? I said, oh, I told you I wanted to work in shock trauma. That's where I work. And they were like, how did you do that? I said, I called the woman who ran the place and asked her for an appointment because I was interested in her unit. And so she invited me in. We had this amazing conversation. I don't remember exactly what was said, but I came prepared and I told her how enthusiastic I was and how much I wanted to work there. And she kept saying, I understand what you're saying, but we've never had students in this unit and we don't have any budget for them. We don't have a protocol for them. We don't have anything. But, she said, well, let me give you a tour. And she gave me a tour of the unit. And I must have said some interesting things as I was walking around seeing what was going on in there. And she came back to her office and had me sit down again. She says, I can't hire you, but there is a nurses orientation happening next week. It starts and it runs for 4 weeks. I'll let you take that. I was like, absolutely.
Game on.
So I went to the orientation. I didn't know what these people were talking about. I was still in school. And I was like, Robin, you better get yourself up to speed because you're the first example of what a student might do here. And so I was like, yeah, you better get yourself together fast. And in a few weeks, I was up to speed and they started treating me like a nurse. They didn't treat me like a student anymore. In fact, when they would have somebody who wanted to change their schedule, you usually a nurse had to replace a nurse, an aide had to replace an aide. And one day, one of the nurses said, well, if I get Robin to do it, can I switch with her? And she goes, oh, yeah, if Robin will switch with you, she can come in and take your place. And so they really did. And I just got elevated and I learned so much. It was like an incredible experience for me. And
again,
and
immersion is the theme.
Yeah, but when I got out of school, they said, you know where you're working, right? It wasn't like, where are you going to work? It was like, you're one of us. And so I never had to apply for a job. They took me right. It was like, you pass your boards, here's your cap and gown, get out of here. And you're going over to work in the Maryland Institute of Emergency Medicine.
Wow. Until radio came a knocking, and that's
well, that was after the Airforce, and then I went into radio, but I went into radio with the same kind of attitude.
Yes.
I had internships that, sort of walked in and created and, moved, as soon as I had learned all I could in one job, I said, there's no reason to sit here and get lazy and bored. It's time to find your next job. And so I was always advancing myself. I wasn't waiting for something to happen or any of that. I was in full control of whatever was going to happen to me. And then I met Howard and I was like, this is a very fast train.
Yeah, all that training of you having to get up to speed quickly came in very handy once you got on that Howard Stern train.
It was another level of interaction with the world and who you are and what you're capable of. And because he was incredibly talented and incredibly skilled at what he was doing. And I was like, okay, hang on. You're going to have to. And my head would be bursting, sometimes at the end of the day, trying to figure out what I should have done and how I could have done things better. But it was constant effort to be that or do that. And when I wrote my first book, I interviewed Howard, and Howard said, Robin, I don't know how you keep up with me because I don't talk to you about it. He says, things come to me in the shower and then I'm like changing everything. And somehow you're always there. And I said, I just decided to be the best dance partner. So whenever you change, I change.
That's great.
I can tell when you're doing something different. And so I figure out what the response is. He's like, that's amazing because I thought I would have lost you along the line somewhere a long time ago.
Well, that speaks volumes to your relationship. There's no question. It's evident, obviously, in how you guys are together.
Yeah, but, again, it's that whole thing of, don't cower in the face of greatness.
Step up.
Step up.
I love that. And it really is like that, even with I keep bringing the stock trading up, but even with your trading, because, you right away are like, okay, how do I up my game? How do I up my game? How do I up? It's like you're not in any way resting on anything, any strategy. It's always like, what's the next strategy? What's the next thing to learn? And I find that really inspiring. You know, when we work together, I learned so much from you. It's like crazy when you started introducing me to this world. Talk a little bit about how you got into stock trading and what about it has you so passionate? Because to me, it seems like I don't even remember you're on the radio anymore. I'm like, you're just stock trading all the time. Like that's all I hear about.
Well, it's very funny because when I was in radio, there was this new area that was opening up called consumer reporting. And that was the thing that the guy I wrote to in Baltimore hired me for. He said, you're going to be a consumer affairs reporter. So instead of just doing the news in the midday block, you're going to be doing things that educate consumers, introduces them to new things, you know, shows people how to save money when they do this or that and all of that. So I started reading the Wall Street Journal every day. And man, was that an education. It was so incredible to me. I'm like, oh my God, every day I open this newspaper and read about trends that are going to be happening. And then 2 months down the road, they actually happen. And if I knew how to get into the stock market, I could make money. And I was like, but I don't know how to be in the stock market. I don't even know where the stock market is.
It's just like this elusive thing, the stock market. It's like
right.
it's like Oz, you know, and it's like the Wizard of Oz. It's like the Oz, Emerald City. It's Emerald City.
Right. So that was my basic feeling about it. It's somewhere, but I don't know where. And the other thing that had happened long before that was watching the Addams Family on TV. Like everybody says, you know, TV's a wasteland and you can't learn anything. I've learned everything from television. So I'm watching the Addams Family, and Gomez Addams sits in front of this thing and he's pulling these strips of paper out.
I remember that.
And, you know, and he's always going on about his dividends and the stock market's up and now they're rich and now they're down. And oh my goodness, you know, my dividends are off. And I'm like, dividends, ticker tape, all of this stuff was fascinating to me as a little kid. I was like, one of these days, I'm going to learn about that. And so here I am reading the Wall Street Journal every day, still never looked at the stock page where they, you know, put prices and all of that stuff. But I did read about businesses and all the articles about new trends. And then I came to New York, and a friend of mine, somehow we were talking, and one day she said to me, oh, I signed up for this course in trading stocks. I'm like, what? And she says, yeah, you know, he teaches us how to make money from the stock market. And I was like, I might be interested in that. And she says, well, you know, we're having, you know, every once in a while he'll have a guest thing and I'll let you know when that is. And that's when I met our mentor, Tyrone. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing he said was, most people don't understand money. And if you have a middle-class background, you think the way to make more money is to spend more time working, you know, trading your time for dollars. So that means picking up an overtime shift or having a second job or having a full-time and a part-time job. And that's what you think is the way to increase your amount of capital. And it was funny to me that he said that, because when I was a nurse, that was the only thing I knew was, oh, there's overtime shifts available. And I'd sign up for the overtime shift. And then I'd get my paycheck and there was hardly any extra money in it because it got eaten up by taxes. And so one day I just said, you're going to have to learn to live on your salary because you're not going to get rich doing overtime. And so one of my friends one day said, you never raise your hand when they're asking for people to work an extra shift. Why is that? I said, could I get rich at it? She said, no. I said, then I ain't doing it.
Good for
That
you.
was that.
But it is
And
the mentality. It is the mentality that most people are brought up inside of and live inside of. So, I love when he does when Tyrone at a workshop will go, how many of you want more income? And everybody raises their hand. He goes, no, you don't.
no,
You
you
want more
don't.
residual
Yes,
income.
yes. And so that was my first introduction to the stock market. And it didn't make any sense to me at first. And I was sort of doing all the stuff I tell people not to do now, trading blind, just thinking stock prices meant something and all of that stuff. And so I did it for about 6 months and then I got sick and I had to get out of the class. And so I was just devastated because I was, finally beginning to see something. And then I had to stop because I had to concentrate on getting better.
Right.
And so that was the end of that class and me. And a few years later, the pandemic happened. And I said, Robin, you're sitting around doing nothing. Maybe you can find Tyrone and see if he's still doing that. And so I went on a Google search and found the Wealthy Investor Program and went on his website and signed up to be in whatever it is, the wealthyinvestor.com or whatever .net, wherever he has
Yes,
his
exactly.
thing. And apparently he sometimes goes through the rolls and sees who's there. And so one day I got an email from Quinn, his assistant, and she says, Tyrone wants to know if you still have his phone number. And I was like, no, I don't. And so they sent me his phone number and we texted back or emailed back and forth and set up a date to talk because I just disappeared from his class. He never knew what had happened to me. And so that's how I got back in. And I was like, this is the perfect time because there's nothing to do. Everything's locked down. I'm working from home. Let me see if I remember how this is done. And I started doing it. And then I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And what can come from this is amazing. And so I just started learning everything I could. I say to him all the time, you've never been listened to like I listen to you. And because I'll say stuff to him. He goes, oh, you heard that? And I'll say,
well, you and I joke about sometimes he'll be like, well, I never said that. I'm like, we took notes and you definitely said this.
But sometimes he'll just say something that nobody else is paying attention to.
Yeah.
Like he went on this, he started doing this conversation about your retirement account, and it was a whole new strategy. And I talked to him the following week and I said, remember when you said blah, blah? He goes, you heard that? Because
so
apparently
funny.
nobody else had called. And I said, yes. And I'm interested in doing that. And then, and it got him to understand because we'd have these great conversations about stocks and companies. And I mean, I told him about NVIDIA a long time ago. And he was like, oh my goodness, it's too volatile, blah, 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 blah. I said, but Tyrone, this is the future. And so, I just started studying everything, listening to CNBC almost constantly in the background and learning about the stocks we were trading and seeing, their earnings reports,
patterns
and what they do and seeing stock trading patterns, the way stocks trade. And I was like, man, when that does that, I can make money.
Yeah, it's really wild. And for everybody listening, if you haven't, delved into this area because it seems too scary or too risky, it's worth at least going online to Tyrone's website and just, for a month, just to look at the videos there and start to learn a little bit. Because if I knew at 20 what I know now, it's just amazing that people don't have the financial education that is available readily available if you know where to find it. So I'm
That's
always
right.
thankful that you brought it up to me during the pandemic when we were having a cocktail Zoom, which was our weekly little thing. And then at some point, I don't remember, I was like, what are you doing? What are you spending your time
Wait a
doing?
minute.
And
What
that
did
was
you
it.
just say? What did you
Yeah.
just say? You said, I want to do that.
I was like, I'm in. I'm in. We were talking about buying a chateau in France. We're looking at chateaus online on our Zoom calls, and I was like, where are we going to get the money? You're like, from the stock market. Just
Yeah, it was
perfect.
awesome. And so,
Yeah.
it was, and like I said, it's always fun for me to expand people's
Yes.
understanding of things and, how things work. But it's also about your being, that is what I have learned over the course of time. You've got to be what you say you are, because the universe is responding to your being, not what you're saying. And
And
so,
that is a perfect way to end this episode. Although I feel like we could talk for 12 hours, and maybe we'll do a follow-up.
we'll
But
do a marathon.
exactly. But being unmessable with is what the universe responds to around you, my friend. And if you look at what you've accomplished in your life, there's no mistaking it. And I think that's a perfect way to, close this out, is just, who are you being? And if you're not being your creation, then you're being messable with. So
Yeah,
whatever you
I always
want.
tell people, if you're just saying something, hoping that it'll catch fire, no, you've got to be it. You've got to feel that. You've got to know that that's who you are.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right. For those of you listening, if you heard something that resonated with you, if you learned something, if you got inspired by something, please rate and review the episode and share it with people in your life that you think it would make a positive difference with, because that's what this is about. This show is about being unmessable with wherever you're not, and fulfilling your dreams now, not someday. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode of Be Unmessable With. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Be Unmessable with the podcast. I always love that you spend a little time with us listening or watching this podcast, and I want to make sure that you get value every time you do. So I want to offer you a free 1 hour workshop on money. Does money mess with you? If you're a human being, then it likely does. At least every human being I've ever met, it messes with them to some degree. So it's not so much how much money you have, but your relationship to money. And we have a free 1 hour workshop that was co-led by myself, my good friend, media icon, Robin Quivers, and our wealth coach, Tyrone Jackson. So click below and you can have instant access to Unmessable with Money. Unleash your inner millionaire.